Hello, everyone. My name is Julianne, and before we dive into the dark, tangled web of what happened to my family, I want to ask you all a quick question. Where in the world are you watching from today? Drop your city or country in the comments below. I read every single one, and I love seeing how far this story reaches. If you're new here, or if you've been following my journey for a while, please take a quick second to hit that subscribe button, give this video a thumbs up, and turn on the bell notification. You won't want to miss a single second of what I'm about to reveal. Trust me, the ending of this nightmare is something you have to hear to believe. Now, let me take you back to the very beginning, to the night the world completely collapsed beneath my feet. I was 24 years old, standing in the middle of a cramped, dimly lit hospital waiting room that smelled sharply of antiseptic and stale coffee. Outside, a brutal November rain was lash-hammering against the glass. Inside, a doctor with tired, hollow eyes was telling me that my husband Thomas was gone, just like that. A drunk driver on an icy highway had snatched away the man who was my entire universe. And to make the tragedy even more terrifying, I was 7 months pregnant with our twin boys. When Thomas died, he left behind no life insurance, no secret savings, and no safety net. We were young, working paycheck to paycheck, rich only in our love for each other. I was left stranded in a tiny rented apartment with a lease about to expire, a body heavy with 2 unborn children, and a heart shattered into 1,000,000 uncollectible pieces. Desperate, terrified, and swallowing every ounce of my pride, I turned to my own blood relatives. I called my older brother first. He owned a thriving logistics firm, drove a shiny luxury sedan, and lived in a pristine gated community. I wept into the phone, begging him to just let me stay in his spare bedroom until the twins were born and I could get back on my feet. Do you know what my own brother told me? He told me that bringing 2 crying newborns into his house would ruin his peace, disrupt his lifestyle, and that I should have planned my life better before having children. He offered me a $50 grocery gift card and told me not to call again unless it was an emergency. Next, I went to my aunt, my mother's sister, who had always boasted about how family was the most sacred thing in the world. I sat on her floral sofa, tears streaming down my face, asking if she could lend me enough money to cover 2 months of rent. She crossed her arms, sighed heavily, and delivered a cold lecture about financial responsibility. She told me that taking in a broke widow with twins was a burden she simply couldn't afford, suggesting instead that I look into giving the babies up for adoption. My own blood, the people who had watched me grow up, the people who shared my DNA, turned their backs on me when I was at the absolute bottom of the abyss. They closed their doors, locked their gates, and left me to drown. And then came Thomas's parents, Henry and Sarah. They were not wealthy people by any stretch of the imagination. They lived 3 hours out in the country on a sprawling, rugged, dirt-poor cattle ranch that had been in Henry's family for generations. The house was old, built from weathered timber and local stone, with creaking floorboards and a roof that leaked whenever the storm got too fierce. Henry was a man of few words, his face lined with deep crevices from decades of hard labor under the blazing sun. Sarah was small, with hands calloused from gardening and baking, but her heart was vast enough to swallow the world whole. When they heard about Thomas's death, they didn't just offer sympathy. Henry drove his battered pickup truck straight into the city, packed up my tiny apartment into the back of his bed, and brought me home. Sarah wrapped her arms around my trembling shoulders the moment I stepped onto their porch and whispered, "You are Thomas's heart, Julianne, which means you are our family. You will never, ever be alone again." For the next 20 years, that rundown ranch became our sanctuary. It wasn't an easy life. Raising twins, 2 energetic, endlessly hungry boys named Ethan and Samuel, took everything we had. Money was always tight. There were winters where we relied entirely on the vegetables Sarah had canned during the summer and the firewood Henry chopped by hand. I took on remote bookkeeping jobs, helped tend to the small herd of cattle, worked the garden until my fingers bled, and did whatever it took to contribute. Henry and Sarah never treated me like a daughter-in-law living on charity. They treated me like their own child. When the twins were sick, Henry would sit up all night by their cribs, humming old country tunes. When I broke down crying from sheer exhaustion and grief, Sarah would pull me to the kitchen table, slide a warm mug of tea into my hands, and remind me how strong I was. They poured every ounce of their sweat, love, and dwindling savings into making sure my boys had clothes for school, books to read, and a safe roof over their heads. My blood family? They vanished completely. For 2 whole decades, not a single phone call. No birthday cards for Ethan and Samuel. No holiday texts. To them, I was a tragic casualty of bad luck, a broke single mother they were glad to be rid of. They erased us entirely, assuming we were rotting away in poverty out in the countryside. What none of us knew back then, what nobody could have ever predicted, was what lay deep beneath the barren, rocky soil of Henry and Sarah's humble cattle ranch. 20 years after I moved into that creaking farmhouse, a major green energy conglomerate sent survey teams through our county. They weren't looking for oil or gas. They were looking for something far rarer. Massive deposits of lithium and essential minerals, critical for the global transition to renewable technology. And as fate would have it, the richest vein in the entire region ran directly under Henry and Sarah's land. When the corporate lawyers came sitting at our kitchen table, they didn't offer pennies. The initial bid made us faint. By the time the final acquisition contracts were signed, the deal closed at a staggering $100 million. Overnight, the broke, forgotten family on the weather-beaten ranch became unimaginably wealthy. The news broke nationwide. Headlines flashed across television screens, financial journals, and local newspapers. Obscure country ranch sold for $100 million to energy tech giant. And that, my friends, is when the ghosts of my past suddenly remembered that they had a sister and a niece. Within 72 hours of the news hitting the press, my phone began ringing off the hook. Numbers I hadn't seen in 20 years flashed across the screen. My brother, the man who once offered me a $50 gift card to go away, sent text after text, claiming he had been desperately searching for me for years. My aunt began leaving weeping voicemails about how much she missed her favorite niece and how blood was thicker than water. They thought I was still the naive, desperate young widow they had cast aside in the rain. They thought they could waltz back into my life, put their hands out, and claim a piece of $100 million fortune. So I invited them over. I set up a formal dinner at the ranch house, the very house they had scoffed at for 2 decades. I let them think they were coming to celebrate a grand family reunion. I let them believe that forgiveness was on the menu and that the money would be shared. They arrived in their finest clothes, wearing fake plastered smiles, their eyes greedily taking in the vast expanse of the land. They sat at our long dining table, drinking our wine, dropping subtle hints about their debts, their mortgages, and how much they needed a fresh start. They sat there waiting for the grand announcement, waiting to see what portion of the $100 million I would hand over to my loving blood relatives. And that is when I stood up at the head of the table. I smiled warmly at my brother, my aunt, and the rest of the parasites who had abandoned me. I reached under the table, pulled out a thick, elegant leather portfolio bound with a silk ribbon, the ultimate gift entrusted to me by my in-laws, and placed it gently in front of them. As they eagerly tore open the envelope, expecting a life-changing check, their eyes scanned the first page. And in an instant, their triumphant smiles vanished, their color drained completely, and their expressions froze solid. When my brother, cousin, and aunt saw that thick, elegant leather portfolio sitting on the mahogany dining table, their eyes lit up like Christmas morning. I could practically hear the mental calculators whirring in their heads. My brother actually wiped a fake tear from his eye, leaning forward to pat my hand with a touch that made my skin crawl. "Julianne," he crooned, his voice dripping with forced tenderness. "I always knew you'd find your way back to us. Family is everything, isn't it? We've all made mistakes, but at the end of the day, blood is blood." "It really is," my aunt chimed in, adjusting her pearl necklace as she reached for the leather folder. "We were just waiting for the right moment to reconnect. We wanted to respect your privacy while you were grieving all these years." I didn't say a word. I just sat back in my chair, picked up my glass of ice water, and watched. My aunt's rings clinked against the leather as she undid the silk ribbon. She pulled out the top parchment, fully expecting to see a set of certified cashier's checks or a multi-million-dollar trust agreement with all their names written on it. Instead, the header printed at the top of the page in bold black serif ink read, "Deed of Irrevocable Gift Financial Assignment." My brother leaned over her shoulder, his eyes hungrily scanning down the page, searching for the numbers. Oh, he found numbers, all right. But not the ones he was praying for. The document wasn't a payout. It was a binding, legally airtight court record documenting every single cent that had been spent over the last 2 decades, not by them, but on them, through an anonymous trust Henry and Sarah had quietly created years ago. You see, Henry and Sarah had always been proud, humble ranchers, But they were never foolish. Years before the lithium was discovered on our land, a small natural gas pipeline had crossed a tiny corner of the ranch, yielding a tiny, modest monthly royalty check, maybe a few $1,000s a year. Henry and Sarah had never spent a dime of that money on themselves. Instead, they had quietly set up a hardship fund managed by a local attorney. And who had that fund secretly bailed out over the last 15 years? My family. When my brother's logistics company almost went bankrupt during the economic crash 12 years ago, an anonymous angel investor stepped in with a $75,000 emergency bridge loan that saved his business. That investor was Henry and Sarah. When my aunt's house was facing foreclosure after her husband walked out, an anonymous relief charity quietly paid off her 6 months of back mortgage payments and property taxes so she wouldn't end up on the street. That charity was Henry and Sarah. When my cousin needed a specialized medical procedure that his insurance refused to cover, a private donor wired $40,000 directly to the hospital. That private donor was Henry and Sarah. They had used their tiny, hard-earned pipeline royalties to secretly keep my blood family afloat, all while my blood family believed they were superior, looking down on the penniless country bumpkins and refusing to give me a place to sleep. Henry and Sarah had done it out of pure, unconditional kindness, never asking for credit, never taking a bow, just wanting to ensure that the people connected to their late son's wife didn't starve. The room went dead, suffocatingly silent as my brother read the line itemizations, complete with canceled checks, bank routing logs, and signed legal affidavits from our family lawyer. What? What is this? My aunt whispered, her voice trembling, all the color draining out of her face until she looked like a ghost. That, I said, my voice smooth and ice-cold, is the full legal accounting of the grace, generosity, and mercy my late husband's parents extended to you while you were sitting in your comfortable houses, letting me and my twin babies freeze. My brother slammed his hands on the table, his fake smile instantly vanishing, replaced by a dark, angry scowl. This is a joke! You invited us out here to show us old receipts? Julianne, you just sold this place for $100 million. You have more money than you could spend in 10 lifetimes. We are your family. You aren't my family, I replied softly, looking him straight in the eye. You share my DNA. That's a biological accident. The people who fed my children when I had no food, the people who held me while I cried, the people who worked until their joints swelled just to buy my son's school shoes, they are my family. I reached back into the leather portfolio and pulled out a second document, sliding it across the polished wood. And that brings us to the second part of the gift, I continued, leaning forward. When the energy company signed the final paperwork for the $100 million acquisition, Henry, Sarah, and I placed $80 million into an untouchable, perpetual community foundation for rural education and pediatric care. My twin sons, who are now 20 years old and studying law and finance, are the sole trustees. My brother gasped, his eyes wide with horror. $80 million? You gave away $80 million? We kept $20 million, I said with a faint, razor-sharp smile, which is more than enough for Henry and Sarah to live like royalty for the rest of their days, and for my sons to build their futures. But as for the remaining trust, the one that secretly bailed you out all those years ago, I paused, letting the silence hang heavy in the air. Because the lithium deal is finalized, that small pipeline royalty trust has officially been dissolved. And according to the legal clause Henry and Sarah signed yesterday, all outstanding anonymous emergency loans extended to third parties over the last 2 decades are now officially called due. My aunt's jaw dropped. Called due? Every single cent, I said, placing my hands flat on the table, with interest. My lawyers filed the paperwork with the county clerk this morning. You have 90 days to repay the estate of Henry and Sarah, or we begin asset liquidation proceedings against your house, your cars, and your business. My brother stood up so fast his chair crashed to the floor. You can't do this. You lured us out here under false pretenses. We came here to make amends. You came here for money, I snapped, the fire I had held inside for 20 years finally exploding out of me. You didn't care if I was alive or dead when I was 24 years old. You told me my babies were a burden. You offered me $50 to lose your number. Well, now you're going to pay back every dime this family spent keeping you from the gutter. My aunt began to sob, clutching her pearls, while my brother stood there, breathing heavily, realization finally dawning on him, that his entire wealthy lifestyle was about to be stripped away to pay off a debt to the very people he had spent 20 years despising. They thought they were walking into a payday. Instead, they had walked right into the trap. The silence that fell over the dining room was absolute, heavy enough to crush a person. My brother stood frozen beside his overturned chair, his face flushed a violent, mottled red. My aunt's hands trembled so violently she couldn't even manage to tuck her handkerchief back into her designer purse. "Julianne, please," my aunt whimpered, her voice cracking as she looked at me with wide, panicked eyes. "We're your blood. You can't ruin us over something that happened 2 decades ago. We were young, we were stressed, we didn't know." "You knew exactly what you were doing," I interrupted, my voice dropping to a calm, deadly whisper that cut right through her frantic excuses. "You made a choice to turn your back on a grieving widow and 2 helpless infants. You calculated that we had no value to you. So I am simply applying your own logic to this situation. Business is business, isn't it?" My brother took a step toward me, his hands clenched into tight fists. "This is extortion. We'll fight this in court. No judge in this state is going to let you strip my business away over some vague, decades-old loan agreement." At that exact moment, the heavy oak doors at the end of the dining hall swung open. My twin sons, Ethan and Samuel, walked into the room. At 20 years old, they were the spitting image of their father, broad-shouldered, tall, with sharp eyes and an unmistakable presence. Ethan was wearing his dark blue tailored suit, holding a crisp black leather briefcase, while Samuel stood quietly beside him, carrying a stack of notarized folders. "Actually, Uncle," Ethan said, his voice deep, confident, and completely devoid of warmth as he stepped up to the head of the table. "As a third-year law student specializing in contract resolution, I can assure you the paperwork is ironclad. The funds provided to your logistics firm weren't classified as gifts. They were structured as high-yield demand notes, signed by your own chief financial officer when your company was 48 hours away from payroll default." Samuel laid a series of official documents directly in front of my brother, and every single signature on those loan agreements is authentic. We had the forensic signatures verified last month. You have 90 days to transfer $75,000, plus adjusted inflation interest, into the Rural Community Trust. If you fail to meet the deadline, we initiate immediate foreclosure on your commercial fleet. My brother stared at my sons, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. He was looking at the very babies he had deemed a burden 20 years ago, now sharp, brilliant young men standing tall as the guardians of the family legacy he had tried to destroy. "You built your success on my late husband's parents' quiet sacrifices," I said, standing up and smoothing down my dress. "You drove luxury cars while Henry worked 16-hour days in the freezing rain to keep this ranch alive. You wore designer clothes while Sarah mended my boys' hand-me-down coats. You lived off their grace while looking down your noses at them, but the bill has finally come due." My aunt burst into full, hysterical tears, sinking low into her chair. "Where are we supposed to get that kind of money? We'll be ruined. We'll lose everything." "Then I suggest you do what I had to do 20 years ago," I said, leaning over the table until I was looking directly into her tear-filled eyes. "Pawn your jewelry, sell your cars, downsize your house. Figure it out. After all, wasn't it you who told me that everyone needs to take financial responsibility for their own lives?" My brother looked around the room, at the legal documents spread across the table, at my towering, resolute sons, and finally at me. He realized with sickening clarity that there was no leverage left to pull, no tearful plea that would work, and no doorway left unsealed. The power balance had shifted permanently, and he was completely at our mercy. Without saying another word, he reached down, grabbed his coat, pulled my weeping aunt up by her elbow, and practically dragged her out of the house. The loud, decisive slam of the front door echoed through the grand hallway, signaling the end of their presence in our lives forever. When the sound faded, the heavy atmosphere in the room instantly melted away. Henry and Sarah stepped out from the adjoining parlor. They had grown older, their hair snow-white and their frames frail, but their eyes were bright and full of peace. Sarah walked over to me, wrapping her soft, worn arms around my waist, while Henry clapped a heavy, proud hand onto both of my sons' shoulders. "You did good, Julianne," Henry murmured softly, his voice rough with emotion. "You protected this family just like you always have." "No, Henry," I replied, holding Sarah tightly against my side as tears finally welled in my own eyes. Not tears of sadness, but of deep, unshakable justice. You protected us when we had nowhere else to go. All I did was make sure the world finally saw who the real royalty on this land always was. Over the next 6 months, my brother was forced to liquidate 3 of his commercial properties to satisfy the debt, while my aunt had to sell her gated community home and move into a modest apartment, the very fate she had once sneered at me for facing. Every single cent recovered from them went straight into the community foundation, funding scholarships for underprivileged single mothers and building a state-of-the-art pediatric wing at the regional hospital. As for us, we didn't move to a gated community or buy flashy sports cars. We rebuilt the old ranch house, preserving its rustic heart while making it warm, safe, and built to stand for another 100 years. Standing on the front porch today, looking out over the rolling green hills where my husband once played as a boy, I know one thing for certain. Blood doesn't make a family. Love, sacrifice, and loyalty do. And no matter how dark the storm gets, justice always finds a way to light the path home. Thank you all so much for listening to my story. If this journey touched your heart, don't forget to hit that subscribe button, give this video a thumbs up, and ring that bell notification so you never miss another upload. Until next time, take care of yourselves and hold the people who truly love you close.